Okay, this simple subs project is basically what you just did in the lab. All the buttons are there. Hopefully they're all named. I do know that the panel has not been named yet because at this point I haven't figured out that I need to name it. So the panel hasn't been named, but I will later. As soon as I figure out that I need to name it, I will name it. But everything else should be pretty much the same. Hopefully the tab order is right. Any questions about the lab while I have it open? Okay, I'm going back to the notes then, picking up where I left off. And where I left off is getting ready to start talking about checkboxes. Checkboxes allow us to make yes or no decisions in our program, or allow users to communicate yes or no decisions to our program. They select lettuce if they want to see lettuce on their sandwich. They select cheese if they want cheese on their sandwich, and if they want the soda, they check the checkbox. Checkboxes are not related. Sometimes we put them in a group box like we did here because maybe they are related, but not programmatically, they're not related. I can choose cheese and not have anything to do with lettuce or tomatoes. I can choose a soda and not have any of these other items. So if you put them in a group box or a panel, that's fine. It's for appearance sake only. It really doesn't affect their processing at all, unlike radio buttons that we'll talk about a little bit later. I usually name them with a CHK prefix, though you can use CBX for checkbox. If you get something else you want to dream up, go for it. It should be okay, as long as it's 3 letters and it kind of makes sense. Checkboxes have a text property, as you saw, that allows you to change the text that's on those checkboxes. But in addition to that, there is a check aligned property. If you wish, you can change the check align and say I'd rather have it in the right-hand side. And now the text comes first and then the checkbox. Most people, including you on a website, would see the checkbox or the radio button and then the text, but you don't have to do it that way. You can even put the checkbox underneath if that's what you want, or above, etc. I'm going to stick with to the left. So that's the check aligned property. There is a checked property that is available at both design time, please. There we go. At design time, but more importantly, it's available at runtime. So if everybody comes in and wants mayonnaise, you could check that. Doesn't mean the user can't turn it off when the program's running, but it comes up as a default in its check state. That property is also available to us at runtime. When the program is running, that's the property that we're going to use to find out if the checkbox is checked. As you can see, it's a Boolean property. So it either has a true or a false in it. The checkbox is either checked or it isn't. It's the only options that there are. There are 3-state checkboxes where there's on, off, and undefined, but we're not going to be using those. That's just too confusing. So all of our checkboxes are either checked or they're not. We can also encode check them or uncheck them. So when we decide we're going to clear the form, we'll go to each one of the checkboxes and say checked equals false, checked equals false, checked equals false. So for checkboxes, a checked property is the equivalent of a text property for a text box, a value property for a date picker. It contains the current value of that checkbox. You can change it or you can read it depending on your circumstances in your program. The most common event is a check changed event. And as we'll see here in a little while, one of the things to keep in the back of your mind is if your code says change the checked property of the checkbox to true, it causes the check changed event to occur. The user never did it, but your code said change my checkbox. It causes a check changed event. The check changed event occurs whenever the checkbox state changes, regardless of whether it was done by the program or by the user. Doesn't matter, the check changed event occurs. Other things we can do to checkboxes, we can change the color, we can change the font, we can change the background color, we can disable them so the user can't use them. I believe in your math program there are either checkboxes or radio buttons. I think they're radio buttons. One of the things before I go too much further here, radio buttons and checkboxes are from the same family of objects. When we first started talking about what's the difference between radio buttons and checkboxes, Steve said one's round, one's square. Now, it sounds ridiculous, but it's a very important difference. And what it really says is behind the scenes, they're very similar. Radio buttons are either checked or they're not. They don't look like little check marks, but they're selected, checked, just like a checkbox. They behave very similarly, and they're basically built from the same foundation of objects. So a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about with checkboxes also applies to radio buttons. Background color, we can disable them. In your next math program, you're not going to allow the user to select radio buttons for division when the second number is 0. You're going to disable them or hide them, either one. We can attach images to our checkboxes. I've seen that done. It's a little weird, but you have pictures with checkboxes next to them instead of text, or in addition to text, for people who can't read very well, I guess. Or if you're making for little kids programs, they click on those buttons and it checks the check. They click on the images and it checks the checkbox. I hope you discovered during the lab that when you want to select roast beef, you don't have to hit the radio button, right? You just click on the words and it selects the radio button. Same thing with checkboxes. Same thing with images. If they're attached to checkboxes, if you click the image, the checkbox toggles. We've already seen text align. We've seen an image align works pretty much the same way. Which side of the radio button or checkbox does that image appear? So let's put one to use. Yeah. As long as you don't start snoring, we should be okay. When we code radio buttons and checkboxes, the check changed event occurs whenever the user selects a radio button, clicks it, turns it on, or turns it off. So let's start with a simple one. Let's write some code for check soda. Sometimes, that was the next paragraph coming up in those notes, sometimes when a user clicks a checkbox, your code doesn't do anything immediately. For instance, if they're trying to figure out what kind of sandwich they want, they're going to click on lettuce and tomato and then go, no, I don't want the lettuce, and then cheese. Oh, yeah, maybe I do want the lettuce. They're going back and forth and back and forth. And we can process every single time they hit a checkbox. Or we can wait until they hit calculate and say, okay, you think you're done now. Now here's your total. So the checkboxes are being checked, but our code does nothing. Other checkboxes respond immediately. Initially, I want this panel to be invisible. And when the user clicks the checkbox for soda, then it appears. So we don't clutter their mind with all the different soda choices. If they're like one of my daughters, they can't handle choices. The more we give them, the worse it gets. They'd never get this order done if we had sodas in there, especially if we had all the sodas in there. So we're going to hide that unless they want a soda. Well, the first thing we need to do is hide this panel, and there's a couple of ways we could do this. First of all, if I'm going to refer to it in code, I got to give it a name. So I'm going to come up here and name it first before I do anything else. PN soda. PNL is fine for panel. Just sounds like a jail if I pronounce it. It's PNL, like the penal colony or something. Just leave that alone. Okay, so pan soda. Now I can name it. And in the other class, I was in the middle of recording this and then I ended up stopping. I had an epiphany. We could set the visible property here to false, right? What happened on my form? Nothing now. But when I run, that panel will be invisible just like I want. But my epiphany is, if I change the property and nothing visible happens to the form, I probably ought to do that in code instead, because some programmer is going to look at this and they're going to run it and the panel's going to be gone. And they're going to go, where'd the panel go? It was there in design. Where'd the panel go? And depending on their mood for that day, they might start digging through all of our code trying to figure out what turned off the panel. And then they'll go, oh, I wonder if they changed. Oh, they changed the property. So my new epiphany is if it doesn't change the appearance of the form, don't change it here in the properties. Change it at runtime. So let's load up form load. Here's my form load event. I'm going to give it a description right away. If you're trying to follow along, I suggest you skip this step because you type too slow. I will save mine. I have to put comments in because if I don't, then you don't in your programs, and then I have to, or depending on my mood, get to mark it wrong. So you don't have the descriptions there. Every method gets a description. Oh, I forgot about this. I built this simple sub skeleton a couple of years ago when I was still using 3-character tabs. And notice whenever I line stuff up, that thing's not right lined up with the P. Well, that's because when I built it, it was 3 tab stops, and now it's 4 space tab stops, because one of my mentors told me, don't mess with that. This is why. It makes a mess. But we can fix it, right? Edit. Advanced. You might follow if you're following along. Format. And now it shifts them all and makes them nice and pretty and indents them properly. And when I click above it, it's in the right spot. So this method initializes the form. Question?
What did you click on?
I clicked on Edit, Advanced, Format. And that just rearranges. I would recommend you do that before you submit every assignment to me from now on. That will save me checking the indentation mark. Because if you do it, if you do that format, your indentation will be correct. And if you forget how to do it, Alan's writing it down.
Format document.
Yes.
Correct.
I don't know if there's something wrong with your syntax to your parentheses, it will not work.
If you have extra parentheses or missing parentheses or curly brackets, then it can't figure out what the heck's going on. So if it doesn't work, you get something wrong with your parentheses, curly brackets. So inside here, now what I want to do is set my panel for soda, its visibility property to false. During the other lab, the if statement lab, a number of you were having issues keeping single equal signs separate from double equal signs. Double equal signs are used in conditions in those parentheses for comparison purposes. Does the name in the text box, is it the same as the string Volker? Double equal signs. When you're doing assignment, which is what we've been doing since Unit 2, use a single equal sign. The only time you should be using doubles, for the most part, is when you're doing comparisons. So now I should be able to run this and see that my panel is invisible. Please. There we go. Now I want to write code so that when I click on this checkbox, the panel shows up. And if I change my mind, the panel disappears. So I want my project to have an event handler for the soda checkbox. How do I create the event handler for a checkbox?
Double click.
Double click like anything else. Good. Double click soda and I get a check changed event. That's the default event for check changed. And for buttons it was click. Why didn't they make this click? Because if it's already on, I could click it, and I don't know, this one could have been click. There might even be, I don't know, I never looked, a click event for that object. Take a quick look here. Is there a click event? There is. But Microsoft, somewhere along the way, said you're probably going to want check changed. And as I mentioned in my notes, the other reason you want to use check changed is if I change this check status in code, the check changed event occurs. That we can't control. What occurs when the checkbox changes in code? Check changed, not clicked. That's another reason to use this event. All right, this one needs a description. This method toggles the soda panel. Actually toggles, let's say show hides. Shows and hides the soda panel based on the status of the checkbox. Now you can write checkbox like that, 2 words. Technically, the name of the object is checkbox like this. I'm getting a lot of comments where it looks like this, and maybe real world they let that go, and I will let it go, but it's just not very. Plus you get pink squiggles. We don't want those. It catches my attention. I'm going to put a space in there just so it's quiet. And I now need to rearrange these so they're in alphabetical order. So check goes between here. So I don't forget. Better to do it now than later. Now what do I want to do? I want the panel to be visible whenever the checkbox is checked. So the first thing I'm going to do is ask if my checkbox for soda is checked. Remember, that's the property we were talking about during the lecture, that if the checkbox is checked, if that's true, then display the panel. So let's add the then clause to that, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. There's my curly bracket, move it down. If that's true, then pan soda.visible equals true. Now this is the way I do the else clause, because there's an else. Went down to the curly bracket, typed an else, typed a curly bracket, and moved it down. Pan soda.visible equals false. Makes sense, even works, but it needs some improvement. Let's make sure it works. Good, 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 good. Okay, that seems to work. So now my program is dynamic. If the user picks something, the screen, the form itself changes. Kind of like your states program, right? And if you were to write your states program today, you'd probably design it completely differently with radio buttons and checkboxes and visible properties while the form's running and all kinds of cool stuff. But we're not gonna. We need to improve on this though, because this was written by a programming logic week 15 or whatever week we're in here student. This is not the way I would write it. First things first, whenever you're checking the status of a Boolean property, that's Boolean, right? It's either checked or it's not. We do not have to compare it to true. What's stored in here? What values? True and false. It's Boolean. So if this has a true in it, this says if it's checked. If that's true, then make the panel visible. Well, if it's not, then it's not true. We do the else and we make the panel invisible. When you have a Boolean variable or a Boolean property, don't bother comparing it to true. This is very common. Very common. It's not a mistake. We saw that it works, but it's a rookie mistake. What you're really saying is this thing in here equal to true? Is this true? If this is true, then it matches this true and we do. But that's kind of redundant. Is true double equal to true? That's what it's really saying. Or is false double equal to true? True double equal to true is true. False double equal to false is false. And so I don't need this at all. You put it in there, I'll tell you, you don't need to get rid of the double equal true. I won't mark it wrong. Unless you don't fix it in the update, then I'll mark it wrong. You don't need it. Let's make sure that works. Still works. Make sense? Don't need it, because this is Boolean. I can improve on this even more. With a little bit of experience, you'll start to recognize when this is true, I make visible true. When this is false, I make visible false. So true, true, false, false. Wait a minute. Again, before I forget, and if. Okay, now I'm going to comment these out and show you another way to do this. I'm not even going to use an if statement. Whenever the checkbox is checked, the panel is visible. Whenever checkbox checked is true, visible is true.
That's easier. That's so much easier.
But it's not easier necessarily to see. The if statement, especially when you're in Unit 5, if statements are on top of your brain going, I need if statements for everything. Not always. This is another one of those where I'm going, you could do that with a one-liner. Can you simplify? Go see Matt because he likes it. He might remember this. And this is definitely simpler. But logically, it's a little harder to recognize sometimes. I still will type if statements that look like this, but as soon as I see true, 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 true in the true part, then I go, oh, there's an easier way. Especially if the false is always set to false. That's kind of your clue that you don't even need the if statement here. When this is checked, this is visible. When this is not checked, this is not visible. Tracks. It's perfect. Still works. What would you say? Cool? Yes. You're starting to see where the logic makes these programs do their stuff. Sequential processing, we can make it do stuff, and it does some fancy calculations that most people have no appreciation for, but you do now that you had to code it. They give an answer, they go, oh, that's nice. But now stuff hides and pops up. Quick question before I go on. If I choose lemon lime and then say, you know what, I don't want a soda. If I turn that back on again, what's going to happen to my radio buttons? Is it still lit up? Should be, because we didn't write any code to turn the radio button off. That's another piece of code you could write. If the checkbox is off, then turn all the radio buttons off. But no, this remembers it. And I don't want to write that code. I kind of like that feature of my program. When you choose a soda and then change your mind, then change your mind again, we remember what you wanted in the first place. So that's not so bad. Okay, so there's our first example of checkboxes. Now let's code some more. I think I'm done talking about checkboxes here. Yep, so let's code some more. In our form, we have more checkboxes. These checkboxes help us determine the cost of the additional items. Now, before I forget, I need to go get the description of this program. I never showed it to you guys. It should have. Here's the simple subs problem description. Need a bunch of radio buttons. Each type of bread costs a different value. Each type of meat costs a different value, and you may only select one. If you had read this ahead of time, only one may be selected, just immediately says radio buttons to you now, or maybe combo boxes. Multiple may be selected, that says checkboxes to you now. In the other class, I took a couple of minutes and actually drew a toe chart on the board. What do I have to figure out? The cost of the bread, the cost of the meat, the additional items. What objects am I going to use for that? RDO wheat, Italian sourdough. RDO turkey, ham, roast beef. I need to figure out the cost of lettuce and whether they want it or not. These are all inputs now. The toe chart for this was quite large, filled up the board. And there's lots of objects on my form, right? Not really. There's more than you're used to, yeah, but there's lots of objects on that form, but not a lot. And for each one of them, we got to figure out what are we going to do. Do we have a check changed event for these checkboxes? When you click on a checkbox, does something happen? No. It just sits there and said, you checked it. That's nice, thanks. What about this checkbox? For that one, there's a check changed event that would show up in the toe chart so that we know to code it. Well, I'm kind of jumping ahead here. I got past the design. We've already coded this. Now for these, nothing happens until you click on button calculate. You could redesign this program. We're not going to. Redesign the program so that when you choose a meat, the total automatically updates. If you choose a different one, the total automatically updates. Pick a different bread, total immediately updates. That would get a cool out of Miguel. But that's not the way we're going to do it. We're going to let them move around here and make some decisions and make some complicated ideas, and then we're going to calculate once and give them their total. If they change stuff, they have to come back to calculate.
You just always keep pressing enter so it automatically on.
No, I won't do any of that. Okay. Plus, notice it's a simple subs order form. This is our first sub shop. You can order multiple subs, but they all have to be the same. You want a meatball sub? We can do that. Can I have a meatball sub and a ham and cheese? No. To go out the door, come back in again, place another order. It's a simple sub shop. If you want this to handle different kinds of SAM, then we're talking about databases and remembering, and we're in the next semester. This is still Programming Logic Unit 5. The quantity would be whatever you ordered up here, 3 exact duplicates of that. Makes everybody in the family happy. All have to have the same thing.
It'd be great if you have like kids.
You'd
They
think.
all get the same.
They all get mac and cheese. It's easy. Okay. These checkboxes, how do we code them? We don't. When the user clicks on one of those checkboxes, nothing happens except the checkbox lights up. But when they say calculate, then we're going to analyze these checkboxes and figure out how much to charge them for their additional items. So I'm going to start writing my calculate routine. Move that into its appropriate position. Button calc would go here. Notice how I ignore this public one up here? I just ignore that. If you want, some of you have been alphabetizing it, that's fine. I didn't write it. It doesn't count. The other thing I've been dinging some people on when I looked at their first Unit 4 programs was the spacing when it's collapsed. That's what it should look like when it's collapsed. Many of you have this squished together. It makes it hard to read and hide procedures. If you're not alphabetized, as they get more and more procedures, it makes it harder to find them. One blank line, not underneath the description. The description is attached to its method. That makes sense. But between methods, there's one blank line. And if you get into the habit, like I've been trying to show you in class here, of always adding the blank line and then always alphabetizing them right away, shouldn't be a problem. Yes, it's painful if you have to do it after the fact and you're all done and you're ready to turn it in. It's 5 minutes to midnight, and then you go, oh, dang, I didn't alphabetize. And then you alphabetize and you mess up all the spacing because you didn't do that right. Then you submit it, and I go, yeah, exactly that. Okay, here we are, button calc. Button calc is going to do all of our calculations. But we're going to start with the additional items. So I'm going to need a variable to hold the cost of the additional items. What type? Decimal. I said the magic word, right? Cost. Dollars, money. Decimal. Add items cost. Every variable gets a description. Doesn't have to be a complete sentence, but does have to be spelled correctly. And this is going to be a total, right? So I'm going to take my checkbox for lettuce and cheese and mayonnaise and going to add them all up. Since this is a total, when you start counting or totaling, where do you start? 0. Not a bad idea to initialize that one, since it's a total. If you have variables that count, how many additional items did they purchase? We could start that one at 0. If you're doing totals, you can initialize them to 0, and then you don't need to do an extra statement later on to do that.
You need, for the 0 on.
Thank you. Actually, it's an integer, so I think it'll go in there, so I don't need it. But if you prefer, this is fine. Oops. That's acceptable. If you prefer that, you may do that. Okay, there's going to be other calculations here because we also have to figure out the price of the bread and the price of the meat, and they're higher up, and me being anal, I'm going to calculate them first, but we're not ready for that yet. So I'm going to leave a little bit of space, put in a comment and say calculate the additional item cost. And that's going to get pink squiggles, and I hate those, so I'll finish it. There we go. But calc is good. If you're abbreviating stuff and I know what you mean, that's the risk, right? Do I know what you mean? You may abbreviate in these inline comments, not in your method descriptions. Now, what do I want to know? Is the checkbox for, who's first? Tomato? Lettuce, tomato, cheese. Okay. Is the checkbox for lettuce checked? If check lettuce is checked. Now, we've already seen that we don't say double equal to true because that's a Boolean property. That's a question right there. Is it checked? And it's a yes/no question. Now, Miguel's frustrated with those parentheses, you just bypass them by pressing tab. It leaves them alone. Even if there's 3 parentheses and a couple of curly brackets, it bypasses them all. That'll save you a little bit of time. Or you can just type them. I'm still typing them because I'm so used to it. I'm not used to these fancy editors that skip over stuff for you. Put them in there automatically. Curly bracket. In your if statement lab, many of you left the curly brackets out, probably by mistake, not because you knew that if there was only one line of code, you didn't need them, but you just left them out. And that's fine, as long as there's only one line of code. I still recommend that you put them in. And then in about 5 minutes, I'm going to take them back out. In this case, what do? I want to add something to the item cost. Plus equals. Whatever's in there now, add this to it. Add what? 10 cents. 0.10. Now I definitely need DM. Well, maybe not. Yeah, that would be a double. So if they check the checkbox, charge them 10 cents. Miguel?
Oh, I was just gonna ask how you wanted this, like what's the best way to do our indentations? Were those brackets and
This is the best way, because it's my way. Okay. The other alternative is to do this. You'll see this in many websites, where they put the curly brackets on a line by themselves. And then they do this for the else, if there were one. Else, and then another curly bracket on the next line, and notice right now that it doesn't even want to do it. That's because there's an option in Tools Options that says put my curly brackets at the end of the line. I have that turned on. If you prefer this technique, which is to me kind of ridiculous because I now have 1, 2, 3, 4 lines with nothing on them except curly brackets. If you prefer this technique, you may use it. You ask me and I'll help you go to Tools Options, and we'll have to go digging around to find the place that turns those off. I prefer it this way because it doesn't waste a lot of space. The indentation still shows me where the true part is.
so put the brackets before the else then?
I put the end bracket. If there's an else, that's what it looks like. Yep. And if you look at my notes, that's what it looks like. Look at my sample programs, that's what it looks like. If you look in your lab, it doesn't look anything like that.
What? Yes, it does.
Maybe yours. Okay. What do I do if it's not checked? Val, what's the first thing that came to your mind? Nothing.
Leave it the hell alone. Just
So get rid of the whole else, right? You don't leave an else if it doesn't do anything. So now I have a simple if statement. I charge them 10 cents for lettuce. What's wrong with that?
What's that?
Nothing.
Oh, if you have
Everything.
your other options.
I'm getting to those other options. Pardon me?
Is it a constant?
Thank you. Could the price of lettuce change? Probably. It's a drought in California last time I checked. Okay. If the price of lettuce changes, now I got to come find this line. Who knows where else I'm going to use it? So yes, we're typing in a literal. It's a decimal literal, but we're typing in a literal. Every time you type a literal, you should stop and think, should I use a constant for this? If it could change, the answer is yes. So now I come up here, and under the partial class statement, I declare my program constants. First one, remember they all start with private. It's a decimal. Call it lettuce cost, and that's equal to my 10 cents. Maybe. Each one of these gets a description. Don't tell me this sets the cost of lettuce to 10 cents. Tell me what this is for. What's stored inside there? The current cost of lettuce. And then down here, I use the constant. That's better. And while you're catching up with me, I'm going to need a whole ton of constants, aren't I? I'll save those for another day. I'm going to need all of these, so here I go. And I can't spell mayonnaise, so I'm just gonna go mayo cost.
I was struggling with that too.
15 cents, 50 cents for cheese, and 10 cents for mayo, and then I can just change all of these. There, the spell checker helps me. Variable names and constant names, it doesn't help me, so there I can type it because the squiggles would help me out. So I have constants for all of those. If you're anal, now that you've finished them, you can line these up. Oh, that's awesome looking. Of course, the next time you do a edit advanced format, puts them all back. So I'm not worried about that. Now down here, what am I going to do for, well, first of all, that's the end of my if, right? Ooh, leaf. What am I going to do for the tomato? Same stuff. Seems kind of redundant, but we're checking different checkboxes. There's really no shortcut to this. And now that I have my constants, so it makes all this easier. Wait a minute. Shouldn't that be an else if? If the lettuce is checked, else if the tomato is checked, else if the cheese is checked. The only one shaking his head is Reen.
Well, no, you want to be able to add them all.
I want to be able to add them all. You like almonds? It's the only treats I have. No candy today. It's 2 questions she's answered. I want to be able to check them all. If I make this an else if, as soon as I get one that's true, what does it do to the rest? It skips them, right? Because if I say lettuce is checked, true, then I skip all of the else ifs in the else. I don't want any of these skipped. I want each one checked separately. These are called sequential ifs. One if after another. They are not really related to each other. The status of this checkbox of this if statement does not affect the execution of these other if statements. They're not indented. They're not embedded. They're not nested if statements. They're not else ifs. They're sequential ifs. They're 4 different questions that really aren't related to each other. It's just a term that we use. I will use it frequently when you raise your hand and say, Volker, why doesn't this work? I'll say you need sequential ifs instead of else ifs. And after a couple of years, you know what I'm talking about. Let's test it. Oh, wait a minute. Can't test it. I don't have any way to display this. I could use breakpoints, but I have a nice handy dandy label. Why don't I just use it? Right now, my label total price dot text is just going to be equal to my additional item cost. Later on, we'll add more to it. But for right now, just for testing purposes, whenever I click calculate, it's going to show me the total of the additional items at this point in the total cost box. So I'm going to pick lettuce. What do I expect to see down here? I'm writing a test now, kind of doing my on-the-fly test plan. I expect to see 10 cents. Cool. How about tomato? 15 cents. Cool. Cheese. And mayo. Individually they work. That means something. But notice I just did 4 tests. 4 different tests. I'm not done yet. What if I leave them all off? Cool. What if I turn them all on? Yesterday I couldn't do my math. Now I know it's 85 cents. Cool. All off, all on, individual. I'm feeling pretty confident in this stage. So that's 6 tests to test my checkboxes. But you can feel confident if you want. But realistically, until you've checked every single combination of checkboxes, and how many different combinations are there here of 4 different items? I think it's 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. So it's 24 different checks just for 4 lousy little checkboxes. And you wonder why there's errors in Windows. Imagine how many checkboxes and if statements that you'd have to test there and all the different combinations. No way. So let's just test a couple of them here. I expect that to be 25 cents. Looks good. 65 cents, yep, 15 and 50. I'm feeling pretty confident. But when you look at these, you've tested them. I look at this code, and if there's a problem, I'm going to see it because I know what it's supposed to look like. I've seen it for 20 years. You don't necessarily. So if you don't test every combination, there's a risk that you missed one. Maybe there's something goofy in my logic when I mix mayonnaise and lettuce that my program wilts. In this case, I think it's right. Takes up a lot of room, though, for those questions. So I'm going to simplify just briefly here. This is optional. I'm taking out all my curly brackets because they're optional, right? There's only one statement. There isn't even an else. There's what it looks like, and if we get a little more anal here, here's what it looks like without the curly brackets. If checked lettuce is checked, charge them. There's only one line there. This is the only time that you will ever see in my code basically two statements on one line, an if statement and the corresponding calculation. There's only one thing to do, charge them for lettuce, and there's no else. Other than that, for me, it's one line equals one command. This is my exception, and you could put them back with the curly brackets, and I wouldn't say a thing. Not even a question mark, not even a sad face. So just go, okay, on we go. Matt?
So why, if you knew they were all gonna, if there's gonna be no else, first of all, if there's no else, then that's when you can have no curly brackets, correct?
No.
If they're only ifs?
No, that's not true.
Okay.
If there's only one statement in the true part, now this is my true part, right?
Yeah.
There's only one statement. I don't need curly brackets. Okay. If there's an else, I can still put an else here. I would never do this because that else looks lost to me. Okay. And I could do something else over here, item cost plus equals 0.
So you still wouldn't need curly brackets for
I
that?
don't need any curly brackets because here's the true part, and the true part only has one statement. Here's the false part, it only has one statement. I don't need curly brackets. If I was doing two things here, adding the lettuce cost and adding the surcharge for the California tax on lettuce, then I would need curly brackets when there's two statements in the true part. I require curly brackets on the else when there's two statements in the else part. So the curly brackets got nothing to do whether there's an else or not. Sort of.
I'm just gonna put them in no matter what.
The easy answer is put them in no matter what. Can I leave them in here?
I hate them, but I'm gonna do that.
Yeah, you can do this. I can live with that. The only risk here is if something happens in the future and I need to maintain my program. If I have to add another line after this lettuce thing, when I charge for lettuce, they also get charged, or when I charge for tomatoes, they also get charged for ketchup or whatever. Then the maintenance programmer has to move that down. The maintenance programmer has to add the curly brackets. So there's some risk in this, but I think it looks pretty good and it's understandable, right? Somebody else nod along with Matt so I can hear you better. But yeah, there we go. All right. It's understandable, and that's the key here. Maintainable, I lose a half point here for maintainability. But I don't expect that to change much. What else am I going to do when they check lettuce? Can't imagine. All I did is took out curly brackets, so it really shouldn't have any effect on the program. $0.85, turn them all back off. And just to be sure, cheese, good. I just took out curly brackets, so really I ought to do 24 tests again, but I don't think so. Not today. So checkboxes are really pretty simple to process. You just check to see if they're checked, and if they are, you do what you're supposed to do when they're, what your program is supposed to do when they're checked. Sometimes they respond immediately, like our soda button. Something happens right away. Other times, like these, they just sit there with their check marks in them. When my program was running, behind the scenes, nothing happened. The checkboxes did their stuff. Nothing happened until I hit button calculate. Then we evaluated the status of the checkboxes and said they want lettuce, tomato, and mayonnaise. Charge them this much. Two different ways to process those checkboxes. We come back on Friday. We'll take a look at radio buttons and how to process them. Once again, there's a couple of different ways to do it, and I will share them all with you so that you can choose whichever one suits you. Some are a little less easy to understand than others. See you then.